I used to work in offices a lot, and the last job I had, I got through a temp agency. They called me on a Friday and said they had an assignment for me starting the following Monday. And it had been a while since I worked in an office, so I thought I should probably do something over the weekend to prepare to get back into all the typing and filing and phone answering and whatnot. So what I did is I had a friend of mine go with me down to the local swimming pool, and I had him tie me up in a burlap sack and sink me to the bottom of the pool. And then right when I was about to suffocate, he yanked me up and gave me a lunch break.
Good morning. It's Thursday, Broken News Thursday, June the 27th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and broken news. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
God save our 13 states. Long live United States. God save our states. Make us victorious, happy and glorious. No tyrants over us. God save our states. We'll fear no tyrants not, nor stern oppressions run, till time's no more. May union bless our land, while we with heart and hand our mutual rights defend on our free shore. God save our 13 states. Long live United States. God save our states. Make us victorious, happy and glorious. No tyrants over us. God save our states.
Thank you. And now, the headlines.
Across the board, I want to thank you all. Mark Tapper, Todd Pyro, Caroline Downey. Great show. Great to be with you all. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow with reaction to the big showdown. Barney and Company's up next. Stu, take it away.
All right, good morning, Maria. Good morning, everyone. I'm sure everybody knows by now the CNN presidential debate is tonight. Simulcast on Fox. 12 hours to go. Ground rules. Here they are. 2 commercial breaks. No contact between candidate and staff. Biden on the right, Trump on the left. Mics muted. Outside speaking time, that is. No notes, no props, no crowd. There you have it. That's what you're going to be seeing. A new poll shows more than half of Americans think this face-off is extremely or very important. More than half. 16% may change their vote depending on what they see tonight. Over 100 million may tune in. May I offer my opinion? It's Trump's to lose. Now let's get to the markets, which could be affected by what's said tonight. The analysts were disappointed that Micron didn't come out with quite the blockbuster report they wanted. The stock's down sharply, looking at a 4.5% loss. That is affecting the rest of the tech sector. Look at the market overall for a second. The Dow Industrials, this is pre-market. Dow Industrial is showing some red ink, down 74. The NASDAQ down just 10 points. Interest rates keep edging higher. Look at the 10-year. The yield coming now at 4.30, and the 2-year is at 4.75% or thereabouts, 4.73% right now. Bitcoin, not much change, 61,200. Oil, $81 a barrel, 81.61. Regular gas up 1 cent, reaching $3.50 per gallon. That's nationwide. Diesel, no change, $3.81. All right. Politics, yes, it's on debate day. Some very interesting polls. The Washington Post says voters in 6 swing states believe Trump is best handling a threat to democracy. That's okay, it's 33 to... okay, that's a different poll. That's a blow to Biden. He's basing much of his campaign on saying Trump is a threat to democracy. All right, here's another blow. Political analyst Nate Silver gives Trump a 66% chance of winning the election. He says it is no longer a toss-up. On the show today, the migrant terror threat, the Tajikistan-ISIS connection, an electoral nightmare for President Biden. Trump's vice president pick, he's toying with us. He says, watch who he's with when he arrives for the debate. You will hear from Senator Tim Scott and his fiancée, Mindy Nose. It is Thursday, June 27th, 2024.
And that was the headlines. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Stuart Varney's My Take.
Biden's open border has let loose some profound problems. Feeding, housing, educating, and caring for millions of people. That is stretching us to the limit. But there is another growing problem that's just beginning to surface. And for Biden, it is an electoral nightmare. I'm talking about the terror threat from migrants. A major attack with illegals involved could decide the election. Earlier this year, U.S. intelligence officials received information that 400 migrants from Central Asia had entered our country using a human smuggling network linked to ISIS. ISIS, that is the terror group knocked out by Trump, but which reestablished itself under Biden. The FBI wiretapped and followed some of them, arresting 8 from Tajikistan early this month. They'd been using extremist rhetoric, including mentioning bombings. Remember, it was terrorists from Tajikistan who killed 139 people at a concert in Moscow. The point is, 40 people from Central Asia enter America every day. There are tens of thousands already here. We can't watch them all. We don't know where they are. The DHS Inspector General says this, and I'm quoting directly. The Department of Homeland Security's technology, procedure, and coordination were not fully effective to screen and vet non-citizens applying for admission to the United States. It is a ticking time bomb. A major incident would crash into the election, and the terrorists know it. They can dictate the timing to maximize their political impact. They are running the show. We are just hoping to catch them first. This is another terrible consequence of Biden's open border and a direct threat to his re-election. Second hour of Varney just getting started.
And that was Stuart Varney's My Take. Thank you. Now, the military shorts.
He was the only conscientious objector in World War II to receive the Medal of Honor for bravery and heroism on the battlefield. His name was Desmond Doss, and he saved the lives of hundreds of American soldiers in the Pacific Theater, many of whom had mocked and belittled him during basic training. As a medic in the 307th Infantry, Corporal Doss earned his first Bronze Star for valor in Guam, followed by a second one at the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines. But it was at the Battle of Hacksaw Ridge in Okinawa where his legend was immortalized. It would be some of the most brutal fighting of the war, and when a retreat was ordered, Doss refused, opting to rescue 75 wounded men who were trapped and facing annihilation. Though wounded badly, Doss refused treatment until all the men were safe. "I'm proud of you," President Truman told Doss at the Medal of Honor ceremony in 1945. "I consider this a greater honor than being president." In 2016, Desmond Doss's life hit the big screen in the movie Hacksaw Ridge.
The U.S. military is planning a hellscape for China. Right, in the event that China invades Taiwan, the U.S. would unleash hell. It would deploy thousands of unmanned submarines, unmanned ships, and aerial drones. And all this meant to keep China busy until help can arrive. With the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command saying, I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities so that I can make their lives utterly miserable for a month, which buys me the time for the rest of everything. And of course, unveiling this plan, it's an attempt to deter China from ever trying it. Right, in an ideal world, you develop weapons not to win wars through use, though that's an obvious bonus if needed, but to deter and prevent war. And so you have this admiral saying the region has got two choices. The first is that they can submit and as an end result give up some of their freedoms, or they can arm to the teeth.
I jumped on D-Day. I jumped with regimental headquarters. They made a special squad of 11 men, and they put me in it. I only knew 2 of the other guys in the squad of 11. They dropped us in the wrong place. We were told the night before, Ike speaking to the demolitions platoon, when he did that at 5 in the evening, the next morning, I was on French soil. At 1 o'clock, we jumped 1 o'clock in the morning at 400 feet, and it takes 175 to open. And then we jumped at 400 feet on D-Day. This group, we didn't think too much of it. I was 22 years old, rough and tumble. I was more interested in what I was going to be doing when I get down there,
They had what we called the strip search. They took one prisoner at a time, made him completely undressed, and searched everything that they owned. When my turn came, I was about one of the only GI that managed to hang on to both of my parcels. A few of them managed to hang on to one. And there's this great big German guard, we'd called him Ham Hands. He was one of our guards in Stalag Luft 6, and he was the most brutal guard you can imagine.
Although he'd already been warned of the incoming wave of 80 Soviet aircraft, it wasn't until the Lightning pilot switched on his radar that he felt his throat go dry. That's because his radar showed countless dots moving towards him, and with the Cold War still in full swing in April 1970, he knew that each one represented an enemy aircraft. As the Lightning closed with the mass of planes before him, the bewildered pilot spotted what looked like rows and rows of Finger 4 formations of Tu-16 Badger and Tu-95 Bear bombers. Having been roused out of sleep at 4 a.m., the pilot felt the strange sensation that he was still dreaming. But then, things got weirder. Because as he began photographing the bombers, he saw the Soviet crews waving excitedly. Some of them had beverages. Others were holding up chicken legs. The Lightning pilot, who had initially feared the outbreak of World War III, realized with a sigh of relief that what he was witnessing instead was the centenary celebration of Vladimir Lenin's birth.
And that was the military shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of motivation.
What if you were afraid of nothing? Nothing. Man, beast, financial, bankruptcy, nothing. Do you understand what that would mean? Once you become fearless, life becomes limitless. I'm not afraid of anything. I should be dead by now. I've been run over by a charging buffalo. Got up, chased it down, killed it. Killed a Kodiak bear with a knife. You can't kill me. I believe that with all my heart. You can't fucking kill me. The people that I've talked about, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, Rockefeller, Steve Jobs, they're all tough. Show me your friends and I'll show you your future. And there are people, and they're available. There's never an easy time to make a hard decision. Never. And the guys that are changing the world, that are introverts, not alpha males like me. Elon Musk thinks the same way. Warren Buffett thinks the same way. Bill Gates thinks the same way. Steve Jobs thinks the same way. Mr. Heineken that I had the thought the same way. Now, we all know the world's fucked up. There are riots every place, right? Not every place, but almost every place. What's happened? In the military, they have safeguards. If somebody's yelling at you too much, you pull out a card and say, chill out. They don't have that in Russia. And they sure shit don't have it in China. If your adult child needs a safe space to avoid offensive words, you failed as a parent. In my day, they used to say, sticks and stones can break your bones, but words can never hurt you. Now it's just the opposite. If somebody bullied my kid on Facebook, I'd go over to the kid's house and I would kick the shit out of the father. With these two hands. And I'd gladly do 3 years in prison for it. Sally and I went to the Grand Canyon several years ago. Grand Canyon in America, you know, the big hole in the ground. And there's a thing that you can walk out over the hole in the ground and you look down there in the big canyon. And there was a Chinese couple, remember? A Chinese couple. And they started to go out on the plexiglass thing. And the father couldn't do it. He was too afraid. So the mother and the two kids, about 4 and 6 or 4 and 7, went around, came back to the other side. And the father was standing at the exit, shaking. And then he went like this to hug his kids. The children were so embarrassed, neither one of them would hug their dad, and they walked past him. Because he was the only father that didn't go out there. That father, that wife, and those two little shit kids will never forget that incident as long as they fucking live. I should have thrown the old man, that little skinny little Chinese guy over the thing. At least he would have died with some fucking glory. If anything, the seminar offends you, your parents raised a pussy. Okay. Now, when kids are 6 months old, they're pretty happy. Unless they got a diaper they need to be changed, right? Kids are happy, slappy happy, right? When they're 3 years old, they're still pretty happy. When they're 7 years old, remember, self-esteem is built the first 7, 8 years of life. But then something happens. And who are you around the first 7 years of life? Normally, a mom, maybe a dad, a grandparent, an older brother and sister. But then life happens. Now, they call it hormones when they turn 15. And then by the time they're 20, they're off the charts. And by the time they're 25, as some of you are in this room, they act crazy. Because life catches up to you because you are now being released into an environment that your family can't control. And if you thought your family were a lack of role models, when you get out there, all the role models you're going to come up against are even worse than your family. Because arguably, ostensibly, your family at least should love you. Other people may pretend to love you, but they don't really love you. Now, I'm not saying love is the answer, because if love worked, you wouldn't be going to seminars. You don't have to be able to rant and rave like I do. But what you have to be able to do is pull the trigger, take action. And reading books and listening to podcasts is not taking action. It's just another form of procrastination. I work at it every fucking day. I don't sit around having lattes, chilling with a Riesling by the canal in the sun. Now, we have people that come to me that are so embarrassed of being a snowflake that life expands and contracts with courage to pain. And now the kids don't want the pain. They want to expand. They want to be able to read a book, listen to a podcast, and expand. I'm attempting with all the knowledge I have to instill in you the psychology of the high performer. Steve Jobs changed the world. I think everybody will agree with that. He wasn't such a nice guy, though. He will be judged because he changed the world, not because he wasn't a nice guy.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you now, the Daily Stoic.
Where, who, what, and why. A person who doesn't know what the universe is doesn't know where they are. A person who doesn't know their purpose in life doesn't know who they are or what the universe is. A person who doesn't know any one of these things doesn't know why they are here. So what to make of people who seek or avoid the praise of those who have no knowledge of where or who they are? Marcus Aurelius, Meditations 8.52. The late comedian Mitch Hedberg had a funny story he told in his act. Sitting down for an on-air interview, a radio DJ asked him, "So, who are you?" In that moment, he had to think, is this guy really deep, or did I drive to the wrong station? How often are we asked a simple question like, who are you, or what do you do, or where are you from? Considering it a superficial question, if we even consider it at all, we don't bother with more than a superficial answer. But, gun to their head, most people couldn't give much in the way of a substantive answer. Could you? Have you taken the time to get clarity about who you are and what you stand for? Or are you too busy chasing unimportant things, mimicking the wrong influences, and following disappointing or unfulfilling or non-existent paths?
And that was the Daily Stoic. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Bishop Robert Barron.
The Lord says to you, what do you want? I'll give it to you. I promise. I'll give it to you. What would you ask for? A nicer car? Or Lord, you clear up these disputes in my family? Or Lord, make them like me better? Or Lord, make me more successful in my job? Don't ask for that. It's all trivial nonsense. Ask for Christ. Lord, I want you. I want a wise and discerning heart. So that now I will know what to do with anything, listen, that I might have or not have. So if I've got a wise and discerning heart, well, then I'll know what to do with the wealth that I have if I get that wealth. I'll know what to do with power if it comes to me. I'll know what to do when people honor me. I'll know how to use that for God's purpose. But if I don't have Christ, all those things will turn on me and destroy me.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day.
Some people declare that to be a conservative means to uphold the status quo, the given, the established, regardless of what it might be, regardless of whether it is good or bad, right or wrong, defensible or indefensible. They declare that we must defend the American political system, not because it is right, but because our ancestors chose it. Not because it is good, but because it is old. America was created by men who broke with all political traditions and originated a system unprecedented in history, relying on nothing but the unaided power of their own intellect. But those neoconservatives are now trying to tell us that America was the product of faith in revealed truth and of uncritical respect for the traditions of the past.
And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day. She's partially right. It's a fallacy. Fallacies are those things that are partially correct. She is correct that conservatism is about making the presumption for the status quo. We're not wedded to it. We're not married to it. It is a starting point. We change, but only when there is a prima facie case or an obvious case for change. What she was describing later on in her statement was not conservatism, but traditionalism. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the 33 Strategies of War. Chapter 29, Take Small Bites.
Chapter 29, Take Small Bites. The fait accompli strategy. If you seem too ambitious, you stir up resentment in other people. Over Overt power grabs and sharp rises to the top are dangerous, creating envy, distrust, and suspicion. Often the best solution is to take small bites, swallow little territories, playing upon people's relatively short attention spans. Stay under the radar, and they won't see your moves. And if they do, it may already be too late. The territory is yours. A fait accompli. You can always claim you acted out of self-defense. Before people realize it, you have accumulated an empire. Piecemeal conquest. On June 17, 1940, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, received a surprise visit from the French General Charles de Gaulle. The Germans had begun their blitzkrieg invasion of the Low Countries and France a mere 5 weeks earlier, and they had advanced so far so fast that not only France's military, but its government as well had already collapsed. The French authorities had fled, either to parts of France not yet occupied by the Germans, or to French colonies in North Africa. None, however, had fled to England. But here was General de Gaulle, a solitary exile seeking refuge and offering his services to the Allied cause. The two men had met before, when de Gaulle had briefly served as France's Under-Secretary of State for War during the weeks of the Blitzkrieg. Churchill had admired his courage and resolution at that difficult moment, but de Gaulle was a strange fellow. At the age of 50, he had a somewhat undistinguished military record and could hardly be considered an important political figure. But he always acted as if he were at the center of things. And here he was now, presenting himself as the man who could help rescue France, although many other Frenchmen could be considered more suitable for the role. Nevertheless, de Gaulle might be someone whom Churchill could mold and use for his purposes. Within hours of de Gaulle's arrival in England, the French military sued for peace with the Germans. Under the agreement the two nations worked out, the unoccupied parts of France were to be ruled by a French government friendly to the invaders and based in Vichy. That same evening, de Gaulle presented Churchill with a plan. Broadcasting on BBC radio, he would address all Frenchmen still loyal to a free France and would urge them to not lose heart. He would also call on any who would manage to get to England to contact him. Churchill was reluctant. He did not want to offend the new French government with which he might have to deal. But de Gaulle promised to say nothing that could be read as treachery to the Vichy government, and at the last minute, he was given permission. De Gaulle delivered the speech much as he had outlined it, except that he ended it with the promise he would be back on the air the next day. This was news to Churchill, yet once the promise had been made, it might look bad to keep de Gaulle off the air, and anything that would hearten the French during these dark days seemed worthwhile. In the next broadcast, de Gaulle was decidedly bolder. Any Frenchman who still has weapons, he announced, has the absolute duty to continue their resistance. He even went so far as to instruct his fellow generals still in France to disobey the enemy. Those who rallied to him in England, he said, would form part of a nation without territory to be called Free France, and of a new army to be called Fighting France, the spearhead of an eventual liberation of mainland France from the Germans. Occupied with other matters, and believing de Gaulle's audience to be small, Churchill overlooked the general's indiscretions and allowed him to continue his broadcasts, only to find that each new program made it harder to pull the plug. De Gaulle was transforming himself into a celebrity. The performance of the French military and government during the Blitzkrieg had been widely seen as a disgrace, and in the aftermath, no one had stepped forward to alter this perception of cowardice except de Gaulle. His voice radiated confidence, and his face and tall figure stood out in photographs and newsreels. Most important, his appeals had effect. His Fighting France grew from a few hundred soldiers in July 1940 to several thousand a month later. Soon, de Gaulle was clamoring to lead his forces on a campaign to liberate French colonies in Central and Equatorial Africa from the Vichy government. The area was mostly desert and rainforest, and was far from the more strategic regions of North Africa on the Mediterranean, but it contained some seaports that might be useful. and so Churchill gave de Gaulle his backing. The French forces were able to take Chad, Cameroon, the French Congo, and Gabon with relative ease. When de Gaulle returned to England late in 1940, he now had thousands of square miles of territory under his control. His command, meanwhile, had swelled to close to 20,000 soldiers, and his bold venture had captured the imagination of the British public. No longer the low-order general who had sought refuge months before, he was now a military and political leader. And de Gaulle was equal to this change in status. He was now making demands of the English and acting in a rather aggressive manner. Churchill was beginning to regret giving him so much leeway. The following year, British intelligence discovered that de Gaulle had been making important contacts among the growing French resistance movement. The resistance, which was dominated by communists and socialists, had started off chaotic, lacking a coherent structure. De Gaulle had personally chosen an official in the pre-war socialist government, Jean Moulin, who had come to England in October 1941 to help unify this underground force. Of all de Gaulle's maneuverings, this was the one that could benefit the Allies most directly. An efficient resistance would be invaluable. So, with Churchill's blessing, Moulin was parachuted into southern France in early 1942. By the end of that year, the increasingly imperious de Gaulle had so offended many within the Allied governments and armies, particularly U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, that a plan was discussed to replace him with someone more malleable. The Americans believed they had found the perfect man for the job, General Henri Giraud, one of France's most respected military officials, a man with a record far more distinguished than de Gaulle's. Churchill approved, and Giraud was named Commander-in-Chief of French forces in North Africa. Sensing the Allied plot, de Gaulle requested a personal meeting with Giraud to discuss the situation. After much bureaucratic wrangling, he was granted permission and arrived in Algiers in May 1943. The two men were at each other's throats almost immediately, each making demands to which the other could never agree. Finally, de Gaulle compromised. Proposing a committee that would prepare to lead a post-war France, he drafted a document naming Giraud as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces and co-President of France with de Gaulle. In return, de Gaulle got the committee to be expanded in size and cleansed of officials with Vichy connections. Giraud was satisfied and signed on. Shortly thereafter, however, Giraud left Algiers for a visit to the United States, and de Gaulle, in his absence, filled the expanded committee with Gaullist sympathizers and resistance members. Upon Giraud's return, he discovered that he had been stripped of much of his political power. Isolated on a committee that he had helped to form, he had no way to defend himself, and in a matter of months, de Gaulle was named sole president, then commander-in-chief. Giraud was quietly retired. Roosevelt and Churchill watched these developments with increasing alarm. They tried to intervene, making various threats, but in the end, they were powerless. Those BBC broadcasts that had started out so innocently were now listened to avidly by millions of Frenchmen. Through Moulin, de Gaulle had gained almost complete control of the French resistance. A break with de Gaulle would put the Allies' relationship with the resistance in jeopardy. And the committee that de Gaulle had helped form to govern post-war France was now recognized by governments around the world. To take on the general in any kind of political struggle would be a public relations nightmare destructive to the war effort. Somehow, this once undistinguished general had forged a kind of empire under his control, and there was nothing anyone could do about it.
And that was the first part of Chapter 29, Take Small Bites, from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, if you're a Democrat, you should be voting Republican because the general distraction afflicting contemporary society does not allow the emphasis and energy of rage to arise. Rage is the capacity to interrupt a given state and make a new state begin. Today, it is yielding more and more to offense or annoyance, having a beef, which proves incapable of effecting decisive change. In consequence, one is annoyed even by the inevitable. Annoyance relates to rage as fear relates to dread. In contrast to fear, which concerns a determinate object, dread applies to being as such. It grips and shakes the whole of existence. Nor does rage concern a discrete state of affairs. It negates the whole. Therein lies its negative energy. It represents a state of exception. Increasing positivization makes the world poor in states of exception. Back in a minute. Thank you. So I heard about how the Department of Justice has been frustrating the Congress in terms of producing documents and other types of information that Congress wants. And it occurred to me something was wrong there. Why was the Department of Justice able to frustrate these claims? And then it dawned on me what was really going on here. In the past, the way things have worked is that the federal government never gets away with that type of attitude, because we used to have a news media, news reporters that were investigative. They had sources within the federal government, the administration or administrations, but within the federal government, and they would simply go to those sources and get the information that the federal government didn't want to disclose. So they would go to those sources, and then they would come out and they'd make a report. According to our sources, this is what this is the documents that the government has. This is what the documents say. Maybe even the sources produce said documents. So there was really no way for the federal government to do this, to block the will, if you will, of the people by just saying, no, we're not going to produce the documents. That's not happening now, because we have, again, a for-profit news media using that for-profit status as a cover to screen or to cover to hide their nefarious intentions, to hide their biases. That's the word I'm looking for there. So that's why we're not getting the information that we used to get. Because, again, for decades, no government, federal or otherwise, could ever get away with. Now, what's really interesting is that there's apparently no investigative reporters anywhere on Earth anymore. There's no investigative reporters from the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC. We understand that because they're down for the struggle with the left and more specifically the Biden administration. But what really is interesting is there doesn't seem to be anybody at Fox that has any sources inside the administration. Nobody at Newsmax, nobody at OANN, and other so-called conservative news outlets. So that's really interesting. That's one of the things that needs to change. Again, for-profit news has got to go. Non-profit news now. Back in a minute. Thank you. A little bit of Maria Bartiromo. This is one of her guests.
Donald Trump does not need to win over the voter that wants to see Donald Trump be Donald Trump. You hear what I'm saying there? Donald Trump needs to win over the voter who looks at him as somebody who can change the course of the way this country is going for them, economically, safety-wise, and border-wise. If he can do that and let Joe Biden flail around with his inability to make sense for 90 minutes, then he will win this debate. If he takes the bait, Donald Trump that is, and loses his temper goes off book. He's going to give the left exactly what they want, making this point, hey, look, Donald Trump's unhinged. If Donald Trump can stay hinged for 90 minutes, he wins hands down.
Well, Caroline, look.
Okay, so this guy's wrong on 2 points. Number one, what he forgets is Donald Trump doesn't need to win the election. Okay, that's why he came out and said, I'll go anytime, any place, anywhere. He doesn't need to win the election. Biden does. Biden must win. If Biden loses this, and basically it's all perception, if he's perceived to have lost the election, or lost the debate, he loses the election. The other part of this that this guy seems to forget is this isn't a debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. It's a debate between Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and the two CNN moderators. Okay, so all the suggestions he's made about staying on point, not doing this and whatnot is irrelevant because CNN isn't going to allow him to exercise his tactics and strategies without a fight. They're going to do everything they possibly can to rattle him and make him mad. They're going to do everything they possibly can. So it's unfair to begin with, but I don't feel sorry for former President Trump because he puts himself in these situations. He's the one that shot his mouth off and said, anytime, anywhere. All he had to do is say, with reasonable conditions, I will debate President Biden. He could have said something like that, and then he can go ahead and make demands like drug tests and things of that nature. But once he says anytime, any place, he's backed himself into a corner. Now he has to accept a 3-on-1 tag team situation, and I would fully expect that the way it's, and also who wins or loses is really going to be determined by the news media. It's going to be Fox is, of course, no matter what Trump does, Fox will say that Trump won, and CNN, no matter what Trump does, will say that he lost. So, back in a minute. Now, broken news, and this is going to be the rest of the chapter, how the news business lost contact with the real world.
If managers tried to impose both, but our friends on the left need to understand the truth of the saying, personnel is policy. Media personnel mostly come from and overwhelmingly work in blue America. Our friends on the right, meanwhile, need to acknowledge that the bias in journalism works the same way as the political leanings of other industries. The bias is implicit and born of groupthink far more than it is by design. Journalists are like coal miners when it comes to culture. They'd need a headlamp to see very far beyond the end of their noses. Left-leaning bias is real, but liberals and conservatives alike should please bear a couple of things in mind. Number one, it is a result of cultural isolation and ignorance more than intent. And number two, there are other, in some ways more profound biases at work. In the past few years, there has been a lot of anguishing over how the news media got the so-called Russiagate story so wrong, so often in so many different ways. I don't here just mean how left-wing opinion mongers constantly overhyped the criminal investigations into former President Trump and his campaign's potential connections to the Kremlin, or how their right-wing counterparts worked themselves into a frenzy minimizing and deflecting allegations related to even the worst conduct by Trump and company. If you were watching primetime cable news or were reading Russo-obsessed sites day and night, one assumes you weren't looking for the straight dope on what was going on. You more likely wanted to be reassured that the story would turn out the way you wanted it to. Trump in manacles frog marched across the South Lawn, or Trump vindicated and his tormentors exposed and destroyed. But we should care a lot less about that kind of fantasy role-playing than I do about the failures of coverage that was intended to be credible and comprehensive. The appeal of clicks and ratings certainly played a considerable role in the failure of mainstream news organizations in getting the story right. In the same way, it made Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity or websites like The Palmer Report and American Greatness as preposterous as they were. But while ambition certainly played its role, a failure of this magnitude required more than just thirsty journalists or even the left-tilted bias that we discussed before. On August 8th, 2016, the New York Times took the unusual step of running the column of media writer Jim Rutenberg on its front page. Under the headline, "Trump is testing the norms of objectivity in journalism," came some advice from the top media writer at the country's most influential newspaper to his fellow journalists. It was time for the impartial press to ditch the journalistic niceties and get in the fight against the Republican nominee. If you're a working journalist and you believe that Donald J. Trump is a demagogue playing to the nation's worst racist and nationalistic tendencies, that he cozies up to anti-American dictators, and that he would be dangerous with control of the United States nuclear codes, how the heck are you supposed to cover him? Because if you believe all those things, you have to throw out the textbook American journalism has been using for the better part of the past half century, if not longer, and approach it in a way you've never approached anything in your career. If you view a Trump presidency as something that's potentially dangerous, then your reporting is going to reflect that. You would move closer than you've ever been to being oppositional. That's uncomfortable and uncharted territory for every mainstream, non-opinion journalist I've ever known. And by normal standards, untenable. Rutenberg wrote that journalists had to move out of their comfort zones to stop Trump from exploiting notions of fair play and journalistic objectivity. It may not always seem fair to Mr. Trump or his supporters, but journalism shouldn't measure itself against any one campaign's definition of fairness. It is journalism's job to be true to the readers and viewers and true to the facts in a way that will stand up to history's judgment. To do anything less would be untenable. Throw out the textbook, Rutenberg said, to keep Trump from getting the nuclear launch codes. The piece caused a huge stir in newsrooms and was soon part of a larger, intense conversation about whether the rules of journalism were just weakening the power of the press to prevent a wicked man from becoming president. If Trump was a virus who was exploiting the media's own genetic structure to win, then they would have to change journalism's DNA. The debate about Trump and journalistic standards came after growing complaints about a lack of activist journalism and the dangers of both sidesism that benefited the bad guys by false equivalence. With Rutenberg and the head of the Times political team at the time, Carolyn Ryan, sounding the call, reporters were told that it was time to go to war with Trump. Part of this was that many in the mainstream press felt guilty about having given Trump such a great platform from which to rain spitballs on his Republican rivals during the primaries. We'll explore that part in a later chapter in more detail, but you could see the thinking in real time. We brought Trump into this world, now we're going to take him out. The problem was, though, that it didn't work. The mainstream press could not prevent Trump from becoming president. If anything, the explicit anti-Trump agenda played even more into the candidate's hands. When the front page of the newspaper of record says that it's trying to go after a candidate, it's pretty easy for that candidate to tell supporters the press is out to get him. The part where Rutenberg and Ryan explain that they're out to get Trump because he deserves it doesn't make it through the translation. Especially for Republicans raised on anti-media sentiment, a media jihad against the GOP nominee made it much easier to disregard the things about Trump that were genuinely concerning. An old political joke I love goes, campaigns treat base voters like mushrooms, in the dark and covered with horse manure. All of Trump's Republican nominee predecessors had tried to explain for decades why voters should ignore unflattering stories in the liberal media. But none of them ever had the press say it was actually on the grind. Just at the exact moment where it would have been most important for journalists to maintain the highest possible standards for objectivity, big-time news dove in the mud with Trump, where he had home field advantage. Their failure to stop him meant not only that a demagogue who, as Rutenberg said, exploits racist and nationalistic tendencies and cozies up to anti-American dictators was president, but also that the press was not as powerful as its elites had believed. The pain of Trump's victory wasn't just partisan bias in the press, it was personal and professional. That doesn't mean that press coverage didn't play a powerful role in deciding the 2016 election, mind you. Whether or not outlets called Trump a liar, or if he had been untruthful, probably didn't make much difference. But the tidal motion of the news cycle sure did, and not in the way many in the media hoped. 30 days before the 2016 election, the Access Hollywood tape confirmed Trump was every bit the boorish, crude old fart in private as his public persona would have suggested. Trump bragged about grabbing women he had just met by the genitals and forcing them to kiss him. A week later, Trump's campaign was close to death. Republicans were openly discussing whether he should step aside in a bid to save the Senate, and his poll numbers went in the toilet. It was the only time after the conventions that the GOP nominee fell below 40% in any high-quality national polls. But it was also the beginning of a remarkable comeback for Trump, who, now convinced he was on his way to a Dukakis-sized defeat and lasting humiliation, got serious. Kinda. The following weekend, he would travel to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where he would deliver a mostly telepromptered punch list of conservative priority points, including judicial appointments, tax cuts, and even term limits. We all know the story. Trump buckled down, to the degree he could, just before then FBI Director James Comey and his crew jumped back in the race to announce the potential existence of more classified emails from the Democratic nominee. But this time the emails were on the icky laptop of sex offender Anthony Weiner, a former Clinton insider and then husband of Hillary Clinton's top aide. Comey had butted in the election in July to announce that Clinton had been cleared of criminal wrongdoing in her mishandling of state secrets when she was Secretary of State. Republicans seethed over Comey's intervention, and he no doubt wanted to show his impartiality to GOPers who oversaw his agency and would still likely be in control of Congress after the election. But Clinton was a lock, so who on the Democratic side would care if Comey went a bit overboard in pushing the Weiner laptop story? Sad trombone, Director Comey. Trump's fear-driven discipline meant that the Weiner laptop dropped not into the usual burlesque of Trump's campaign and constant media outrage, but a more typical campaign climate. Trump had clawed back 4 points in the average of polls, and with a nudge from the FBI, that was enough to thread the needle in 3 big blue states to mark the most astonishing upset in modern political history. The combination of the Access Hollywood tape, Comey's overconfidence, and the media's desire for something to cover meant that Clinton was leading the news at just the wrong moment. In 2016, both candidates were unpopular, so it was never helpful to either candidate to make persuadable voters dwell too much on them. And worst of all for Clinton, the late-breaking pseudo-scandal, there was nothing new on the laptop, had reminders of so much that was unpleasant about the Clintons' would-be dynasty. You can see how his compounding errors made Comey desperate to show that he was against Trump and to bring down or contain his presidency over Kremlin sympathies. Similar motives were present in the press. Not only had the decision to mud wrestle with Trump shown the media to be far less powerful than its own elites imagined, but without Trump even trying, the press had followed a scandal cycle that very well could have made the difference in such a close race. The Russia story offered a way to make good on their failings in the campaign and to apply the one-sidism in a more studied, intentional way. A word here about the actual facts of the case. America knew from the summer of 2017 that Trump's campaign had tried to collude with Kremlin sources to try to get dirt on Hillary Clinton. Quote, very high level and sensitive information, but is part of Russia and its government support for Mr. Trump, as it was described in an email to Donald Trump Jr. from an associate looking for a meeting. The Trump team first lied about a meeting with Russian emissaries in Trump Tower that included Trump's campaign manager, son, and son-in-law. Then the line was that the meeting had been about facilitating U.S. adoptions of Russian children. Then the line was that, yes, the meeting had taken place, but Trump himself found out about it along with the rest of the country. Then Trump admitted that he had written the press release lying about the nature of the meeting. It was an easy next step to the typically Trumpian response of saying that he had done it, he was glad he had done it, and anyone else would have done the same thing. As we would see even more clearly in 2020, Trump has few limits, if any, for what he would do to obtain and keep power. His ham-handed extortion of Ukraine's president for dirt on Joe Biden should have removed all doubt about Trump's disregard for decency in such matters. What Trump did before and after the November 2020 election to try to steal another term obliterated even that low standard. But even 6 months into Trump's term, everybody already knew that Trump's campaign had been thirsty for help from the Kremlin and was willing to lie about it. But by then, the idea of something simple and obvious had been blown away by the Moby Dick of Trump stories, the investigation led by special counsel Robert Mueller. Mueller, Comey's predecessor, had been tapped to lead the probe by the Justice Department after Trump fired Comey over, as the president would remarkably admit on the NBC Nightly News, the investigation into Russian election meddling. The Mueller probe offered a couple of important things to reporters, editors, and producers. First, a chance to finally bring Trump down. And second, month after month of exciting, big if true, stories that were impossible to disprove. An infinite well of intrigue. And so began a 2-year loop of anonymous tips, rank conjecture, and endless overhyping of irrelevant or decontextualized information nuggets. Outlets reported on Mueller's lunch habits, the subpoenas that may or may not have been sent, the lawyers who were seen going in and out of offices. Each passing week of obsessive coverage raised the expectations more and more for the findings. Would Trump's children be indicted? Would Trump be indicted? Would Republicans turn on Trump like they finally did on Nixon with Watergate? Doesn't this really seem like Watergate, guys? Like, really, really? Do you think the P-tape is real? When it was over, though, Mueller delivered a report that told us what we substantially knew. Russia tried to sow discord in the 2016 election and tried to help Trump get elected, including by hacking Democratic emails damaging to Clinton. Trump's campaign tried to collude with Kremlin emissaries at the Trump Tower meeting, but some mix of incompetence and a desire for self-preservation by Trumpsters prevented the deal from being consummated. It was also later revealed that the FBI cut corners to get the wiretaps to surveil Team Trump. Moby Dick swam out of sight. So why were reporters so credulous about the rumors whirling through Washington? Part of it was obvious laziness and ambition, always a dangerous combination. Part of it was bias. Part of it was pride. Part of it was an over-reliance on anonymous sources, a symptom of lazy ambition. But how about elitism? That's part of the theory of populist media critic Matt Taibbi, as he lays it out in his book, Hate Incorporated, and in his widely circulated newsletter. Taibbi, who rose to fame for his gonzo attacks on the financial industry in the Bush administration's foreign policy, has turned into a popular figure in some circles of the right for his attacks on cancel culture and the media in general. Like others in the left-right populist space, he sees economic elitism and moneyed interests as the cause of many problems in the press. The news business is absolutely different in a class sense than it once was, particularly at the national level, he writes in Hate Incorporated. These days, it's almost exclusively the preserve of graduates from expensive colleges, when it was once a job for working-class types who started as paper kids or printers. He says that journalists are now college-educated elites like the people they cover and have lost the scrappy working-class spirit that once made them skeptical of the rich and powerful. The next generation of national political reporters viewed people in power as cultural soulmates because at least socially they were. While sports writers for a while remained hardscrabble, cigar-chewing types who hammered team owners and managers for every tiny mistake, political reporters became professional apologists, constantly telling us how hard it is for politicians to win elections and run things. Taibbi says that this class loyalty in journalists makes them too credulous about the claims of their fellow elites on things like Russiagate. Media critic Batya Ungar-Sargon makes a similar argument in her book Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Increased college attendance among pressies, she said, led to a status revolution in the industry. In the 1930s, she writes, 30% of journalists had gone to college. By 1960, it was 2/3. By 1983, it was 75%. By 1992, it was 82%. And by 2015, 92% had gone to college. Ungar-Sargon says that 1/3 of Americans have a bachelor's degree and 46% have never attended a single college class. And that, she argues, helps set journalists apart as an elite caste. I'm certainly open to the idea that many in the news media are out of touch with the experiences and viewpoints of many of their fellow citizens. We spent quite a while in this chapter going over the geographical, cultural, and political isolation of many in the industry. But I'm not so sure about the idea of college being a major driver of those problems for the news business, or in profoundly different ways than other similar jobs. I certainly take Taibbi's point about the loss of a scrappy, irreverent sensibility that makes for good journalism, but if there is a college problem, it's hardly unique to the news business. Ungar-Sargon cites research that says 30% of journalists had attended college in the 1930s, far higher than the 4% of the adult population in 1930 with bachelor's degrees or more, according to the data compiled by the National Center for Education Statistics. In 1930, though, college was, like the newsrooms of the day, overwhelmingly white and male. We don't have numbers by race and gender prior to 1940, but even then, 6% of adult white males had college degrees compared to 1% of black men and 4% of white women. Black women with college degrees did not even register statistically. It is surely true that the share of journalists with college degrees exploded between the 1930s and 1960, when Ungar-Sargon says college degrees in journalism doubled to include 2/3 of the workers in news. And it's also true, according to labor statistics, that only 8% of the adult population in 1960 had degrees. But guess who also doubled their college attainment levels since 1940? White dudes, who were still pretty much the whole story. If modern newsrooms, according to Pew, are 3/4 white and 61% male, just imagine what things looked like back in the Don Draper era. In 1960, journalists were on track with the national trend for massive increases in college attendance driven by the GI Bill. The share would increase in rough symmetry to the national norms for adults and what we see in other white-collar jobs. By 2015, when 33% of all adults 25 and older were college graduates, Ungar-Sargon's research says 92% of news workers had gone to college. Industry-specific data on college degrees can be tricky by classification, but lots of other similar jobs saw massive increases in degree holders. Think of sales, agriculture, hospitality, or office management, jobs that may not require graduate degrees even for executive spots, but where bachelor's degrees are now the norm for career track workers. I doubt that was the case in the 1930s in those fields any more than it was journalism. What about other vocations of similar socioeconomic status? School teachers are required to have degrees to meet accreditation requirements, but even there, you can see the college boom. In 1961, 15% of public school teachers had no college degree. By 1976, it was less than 1%, according to Department of Education reports. Even in their credentialed space, teachers are still nudging up a bit. In 2019, 4 or 5% of all public school teachers had doctorates, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Almost 77% of child, family, and school social workers have at least a bachelor's degree, nearly 40% of whom have advanced degrees, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Like with teachers, there are certification requirements that have driven those numbers up, but they are also a function of the same degree inflation that hit newsrooms and every other white-collar workplace. I doubt Taibbi and Ungar-Sargon would argue that having such a high percentage of college graduates among social workers has diminished their empathy for the people they're trying to help. Maybe the media critics would say that the membership of social workers in the caste of the college-educated has caused them to be less willing to fight existing power structures, as they allege of reporters. But I doubt it. There are some jobs of similar status to reporters that don't have college-going rates that are as high. For instance, the Bureau of Labor Statistics classifies paralegals and legal assistants together and finds that this group includes 54% of workers without at least a bachelor's degree. But beyond that and a few other gigs, if you're working in what is now pretentiously referred to as the knowledge sector, college is the norm, which means a degree just isn't the social stratifier it once was. I am certainly willing to believe that the fetishization of college has had lots of bad consequences for American life, just not that it is unique to the news business. There's certainly something to the stifling effect of credentialing and academic elitism in big national organizations. But I want to make sure that we're keeping the tens of thousands of newsroom workers and the thousands more who work in support roles in mind here too. If you went to Columbia or another rarefied school with the same people you are covering, that's an implicit bias nightmare, to say nothing of the possibilities of outright back-scratching and favor trading. Ben Bradley of the Washington Post was helping his fellow Harvard man, John F. Kennedy, hash out presidential speeches at night and then directing coverage as Washington bureau chief for Newsweek the next morning. That kind of thing no doubt still goes on today. I'm not, however, worried about the fact that you need a college degree today to work in news, even if I wish more aspiring college journalists studied something other than journalism in school. We'll revisit that in the closing chapters, though. But whatever college does or doesn't do to journalists, the bubble is real up and down the industry. The thickness may vary, but there is a barrier that is making matters worse. But what happened to create it? We know about how consolidation, isolation, implicit bias among bosses, and the free movement of labor and capital helped alienate the people from the press. But there is something even more integral to consider. There are lots of reasons that the vocation of journalism has evolved into a homogenous tribe, a tribe that is badly out of touch with the needs and interests of the consumers it is supposed to be serving. But one of the causes is the standardization of the industry after World War II and the new, professional, jargony language that standardization produced. As we discussed in the previous chapter, there was lots of good that came out of the era, particularly the new emphasis on impartiality that national-scale broadcasting required. But this also invited a great deal of weasel wording. That's the newsroom term for writing around something difficult. If you don't want to offend anyone, you can hide your meaning in abstrusions and slink away weasel-like. C.S. Lewis was a stout champion of clear language, including in journalism. His 1943 book, The Abolition of Man, is a zealous denunciation of gushy, quavery language, then growing in popularity among programmatic technocrats of the West. The slim volume is a thrilling harangue against the numbskull educators who are always looking for a way to define literacy and thereby language in pseudoscientific terms. Literacy isn't a phonetic understanding of words, the ability to read and write. It is your portion of the rich, dense cultural knowledge defined by our common language. Lewis was attacking what was, and very much still is, a systematic way to water down our words for the sake of a polite, bloodless way of talking that demands ample ambiguity. Corporate blabber, diversity blabber, legal blabber, technical blabber, and on and on and on. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our civilization needs is more drive, or dynamism, or self-sacrifice, or creativity. In a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and demand the function. He wrote in The Abolition of Man, which was first delivered as 3 evening lectures on the teaching of English in the upper forms of schools in 1943. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. we castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. Lewis saw that the way that children were being taught to speak, write, and think about language was directly at odds with the capacity for moral reasoning and its partner, clear understanding. Some areas of language have always been more prone to fluffy filigree. Public life, business, and academia are chief among them. But Lewis saw ahead to where we live now, when the intentionally obfuscatory, feeling-based language of the politician or advertiser has become the everyday way we communicate with each other, and therefore how we think. Every emoji is a tiny squirt of squid's ink to obscure the bluntness of a message. Almost every business or government memorandum tries to build a big enough boulder of blather for the author to either hide under or roll on top of you. The chest, as Lewis described it, was the part of us that keeps an inventory of our passions and, we hope, orders them virtuously. The head rules the belly through the chest, the seat of magnanimity, of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. Clear, strong, sincere words are necessary to put our attachments in the proper order and to maintain them. Whether you are a Christian like Lewis or not, there's no denying the need for virtuous order in the human heart. From classical philosophers to the Buddha to modern psychoanalysts, we have always known that some things are more important and more worthy than others. To sacrifice for the weak, to protect others, to tell the truth, to be free, to be just, to be merciful. All of those things fit the grooves of the human heart. Mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal in 1670 said that within us was an infinite abyss that can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object. A happy life, Lewis said, requires the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it. Pascal and Lewis believed that infinite abyss could only be ordered by the God of the universe and his laws. But everyone knows the truth we teach to children. If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. How we talk is how we think. How we think is how we order our affections. How we order our affections determines how we behave. How we behave determines how healthy we are as people and as a society. Without clear language, we can't describe virtue and vice, so we can't order our affections. One should choose carefully the opinions she or he is willing to stand up for about who you are and what you believe, and let most of the rest of them go. Or, as they would say on the North Fork of Short Creek, opinions are luxury items. Don't have more than you can afford. It matters whether you believe in the American system or the unalienable rights of all mankind. It doesn't matter whether you prefer hot fudge or butterscotch. Butterscotch, obviously. To decide what matters, we need healthy chests, and those require clear language. But the clunky, self-validating kind of language that has anesthetized the American brain to such heroic-sounding considerations is everywhere. The inanities of chestless language burst out like great geysers from the overflowing lake of bull that our society produces every day. Buying a house or checking into a hospital today uses loads more words than the founding documents of our civilization and some of the greatest works of philosophy. The Hertz car rental agreement at 8,592 words is almost twice as long as the Constitution. But these useless boilerplate words of today are there to protect us from a very modern kind of disaster, being understood for saying what we mean. We tell ourselves that we pile up language in this way so that we won't be misunderstood. Yes, a healthy discourse always requires some politesse, especially with strangers and with those who we love most. We should always choose our words carefully to be understood exactly as we mean, and never in such a way that inflicts harm for its own sake. But often, what we really mean is that if you are deeply offended by what we say, we are only kidding. Or that if you think that we are wrong, we did acknowledge that the story or fact was controversial or that it was reportedly true. We can hedge and harumph and look for a seam in the defense to bolt for a quick gain or escape to avoid a serious loss. This is the tragedy of newspeak, a kind of jargony, arch, verb-free chatter that pours into the infinite gullet for hashtag content in the news business. It is wreathed in the superfluities of graduate school or boardroom gasbaggery that slow or destroy so much that is hopeful and good in the world. It is asphyxiating language used as protection, but it is truly deadly. What Lewis warned Britain's educators about in his speeches would certainly apply to the unnecessary vamping and hippopotamus yawns that are passed off as debate or interview on a given day's TV news. When words were more costly to journalists because of the restrictions of time and space, good news writing was about quick concision. The goal was to be as deeply understood as possible in the fewest words possible. But now we live in a news world that is less edited, more wordy, and that has less in common with the way people actually communicate. I find when writing a piece that won't appear in print, it is hard to resist the temptation to complicate what should be simple when I know that space is theoretically unlimited. Of all the ways that the news business has weakened its relationship with consumers, the loss of a common language has to rank high on the list. And if we lose the ability to speak clearly, much trouble will come after.
And that was the end of Chapter 3 from Broken News, Why the Media Rage Machine Divides America and How to Fight Back by Chris Steyerwalt. Back in a minute. Thank you. The following is one of my voiceover demos. If you're a voiceover artist and you would like to advertise one of your demos on my podcast, please send an MP3 to thedrill12, all one word, at gmail.com. That's thedrill12 at gmail.com. Back in a minute. Americans love scenery. We want to see it all, from one coast to the next. Mount Rushmore down to the Everglades. So hop into a Chevy Malibu and take the scenic route. It's the car you knew America could build. There's a place where people count on friendships they can trace back generations, where they can count on the same stool at the coffee shop waiting for them every morning. This place is called Glen Ellen, and you can find it in every bottle of Glen Ellen wine. This is craft brewed Herman Joseph's, the smoothest, easiest drinking specialty beer in the entire solar system. And I believe you'll find drinkable in the dictionary right after don't order a beer you can't drink. Zoingo! Boingo! The freestyle pogo with more boing, more bounce. Bounce further, bounce higher with Zoingo Boingo. To see what makes Arrowhead Mountain Spring water different from those other waters, you have to go back to the source. And with Arrowhead, that means going back a little farther and longer than most. Between security challenged and security strengthened, there's one important word: how. And it is the how that makes all the difference to our nation and our world. Lockheed Martin. We never forget who we're working for. What makes Kraft Singles so good? 2 out of every 3 kids don't get the recommended amount of calcium. But with Kraft Singles, they get a good source of calcium and the taste they love. Kraft Singles. Magic every single time. Throw boring overboard with a new real meal from Long John Silver's. A meal worthy of a plate. Just $4.99. Only at Long John Silver's. We may not all be geniuses, but we can all do something smart. Introducing the Hyundai 199 Sonata Lease. It's a smart deal on a really smart car. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.